Okay, guys, we have to talk about this. After this past weekend and Kraven the Hunter's abysmal box office performance, there was a lot of reporting about how Sony was just absolutely done with its Spider-Man adjacent villain universe expansion into this Sinister Six and everything. The only thing that they were going to be working on was Spider-Man 4, Across the Spider-Verse 3, and Spider-Man Noir. And while a lot of people were quick to gobble up that information because, quite frankly, Sony's villain universe has never been super popular with fans, I kind of took it with a grain of salt. Obviously, the vast majority of these movies have been somewhat successful. Even if you hate to admit it, Sony has said that they are making a profit on Morbius.
Doubt. Be skeptical. Hard to believe. The story you're currently speaking of seems illegitimate. Given the lack of credible evidence you are presenting, I find it highly difficult to place any trust in the more than likely fabricated alibi you have given me. When one considers all the
Despite the memes and them reintroducing that movie into theaters to kind of abysmal results. The same probably can't be said about Madam Web and Kraven at this point. Whether or not those movies leg it out in the long run is anybody's guess. But as I've already talked about on this channel multiple times, movies generally make money in the long run, even if they're box office flops. So who knows? I don't really care one way or the other. Whether or not this is the only time we're ever going to see Dakota Johnson's Madam Web or Aaron Taylor Johnson, I guess no relation, whether we're going to see his Kraven again is really up in the air. With that being said, I never really looked at it from a perspective of, well, Sony's just going to give up. Quite frankly, so long as they have the rights, they can make movies all day with Marvel, or they can make the animated Spider-Man movies. It doesn't really matter. What does matter, though, is whether or not they think they're going to move forward with a good idea or not. And I feel like there's a lot to be said about the placement and the overall effect that the last couple of movies in this SPUM universe have had over the last several months. One being, yes, we've seen delays from COVID, as well as the strikes and everything, kind of resulting in Sony putting out probably more than they should have this year with Madam Web, Kraven, and the third Venom movie. The only one of which that did even remotely good was the third Venom movie, which itself was based around kind of this weird cultural phenomenon from the first Venom movie that, despite its lack of quality, was charming enough for people like me to really jump on board and be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to keep watching these because I'm having fun. I like the third Venom movie. Didn't necessarily like the other two, but with all that being said, there has been a lot of reporting that there's been a ton of back and forth about whether or not Sony is going to continue making these movies. And a lot of insiders coming out and saying, well, one, they were never trying to build a cinematic universe. I call foul on that. I think that that's absolute BS, considering everything that we've read up until this point and everything that was happening in kind of the interim in the movies. Obviously, we've had a lot of stuff shown from the production of these movies that show that they were trying to tie it to the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield versions of Spider-Man, as well as somewhat hint that they were connected either in large or kind of on the outskirts of the MCU. At the same time, there are insiders now who are talking about how the deal with Marvel never precluded Sony from using Spider-Man in any of these movies. And for whatever reason, the huge success of Venom just gave Sony the wrong impression that the audience was more than willing and capable of watching a Spider-Man villain movie without Spider-Man. And the thing is, I don't buy that at all. There's credible allegations that there was intended to be cameos and various negotiation tactics that led to Tom Holland calling Kevin Feige and Bob Iger when the deal started breaking down after Far From Home, where Tom Holland was just unwilling or did not want to be a part of Sony's universe. Like, he didn't want to be solely regulated as the Spider-Man of Sony's universe. To me, there's a lot more there and has been there that would seemingly suggest that within the deal with Marvel and Sony, there is more of a, hey, you cannot do this live action, right? The insiders from this Variety article that I'm working off of talk about how obviously they've been able to make Spider-Man content and Spider-Man as a character in their movies since the beginning of their deal with Marvel, pointing specifically to the Beyond the Spider-Verse and Cross the Spider-Verse films, where you have actual Peter Parker characters on screen with Miles Morales. The distinction is these are not real human beings. Like, nobody is going to go into an Across the Spider-Verse or Beyond the Spider-Verse movie and get confused on why Tom Holland isn't there. This is not live action. They're not a continuation of anything that we've seen before. For me, everything seems to point to that, hey, you can do whatever you want with all these other characters and everything. What we really want is Spider-Man, and to be able to use that specific Peter Parker character in our MCU playground. He is ours, and you cannot tarnish that brand by putting him in any of your other movies or even recasting somebody else to be Peter Parker or Spider-Man in any other version. And if you do, he can't be a named or real meaningful character. We saw this with Madam Web, where everyone was talking about how we're going to be dealing with Ben Parker and his family before the birth of Peter Parker. They couldn't even say his name in that movie, as well as all of the rumors and everything about there being a child Peter Parker in the Venom universe with the third film. They absolutely avoided using Venom in any way possible and No Way Home. And yet there seems to be insiders or people in reputable news sources like Variety who are trying to tell us that, hey, they've been able to use Peter Parker all the time. They just decided not to. And I absolutely call BS on that, because why would they give up the opportunity of putting $1 billion asset in any of these films if they thought that, hey, nobody would care? After Madam Web, you don't think anybody's going to care? After Morbius, you don't think anyone's going to care? What would be the harm in being like, hey, we have the strikes, we have all these things pushing back Kraven multiple months, maybe figure out a way to put Spider-Man in there so we can at least sell that on the front end, and then maybe more people than what actually showed up would show up to watch this movie. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I feel like a lot of these people are lying, or it's being intentionally misrepresented to make Sony look worse than they otherwise are. Look, you can have whatever thought process you want about any of these movies, but I don't really blame Sony for making bad movies. I think it's ridiculous to suggest that they would otherwise leave out $1 billion asset from any in particular movie with the vain idea that, like, comic book movies are so popular that people are just going to show up and watch them regardless of their overall quality or character being presented. I just cannot buy that in this modern age. I've talked about this a lot on this channel, more specifically with the Saw franchise, but it does relate to everything, especially when you're talking about probably one of the most viable assets and characters in cinema over the last 2.5 decades. IP is everything. Characters, interaction, audience awareness is everything. If Sony had the ability to get Tom Holland into any of these movies, they would have done it. If they had the ability to cast a new Spider-Man and just throw it to the audience and say, hey, this is a new Spider-Man, this is our Spider-Man, accept it, they would have done it. And it would have worked. If they had the ability to get Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield in this universe and say, hey, you know what, this is tangibly related to Sam Raimi's films, or it's more related to the Amazing Spider-Man movies that we cut off after the second one, accept it, they would have done it, and it would have done so much better for Kraven or Madam Web or anything else to play in that sandbox, let alone just doing their own thing. So at the end of the day, I don't think that Kraven's box office disappointment, or even the lackluster showing of the last Venom movie or Madam Web or anything that came out this year, is going to kill Sony's intention on making more of these movies. If these rumors are true, or if the contracts have been renegotiated or whatnot, I feel like if they can use Spider-Man, they're certainly going to start using Spider-Man, but I wouldn't take any of this as certain, because if they could, they probably would. And the fact that they didn't kind of, at least to me, says they didn't have the right to. They couldn't just simply make the right, smart decision. And in fact, they were doing the best they could to make the best films that possible. And I have my thoughts and doubts and stuff. We can cover those later if y'all want. But I just wanted to cover that thought process that Spider-Man in live action isn't a value asset that Sony is willingly being allowed to use when they have this ongoing deal with Marvel. I feel like Tom Holland's Spider-Man is the only related Spider-Man allowed on screen unless it's made explicitly clear that the MCU is away from the multiverse. As they did with Morbius, right? Michael Keaton's character came into the Morbius and Venom universe and is seemingly stuck there for all eternity and everything because they're not going to do anything with that. Maybe because of that, maybe because of the machinations there, they've already laid the groundwork to use a new Spider-Man, and all those other movies that came out after Morbius were just too far along in development. But at the same time, there was a lot indicating that Kraven was really re-put together on the back end to add way more superhuman and superhero elements than were otherwise put in the first final product. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm overthinking this, but quite frankly, I feel like this story and everybody's discussion of it about whether or not Sony's universe of Spider-Man villains is dead or that Spider-Man could be used in any way, shape, or form is all overblown. I'm going to say no and no. They're still going to move forward with what they have. Venom, for what it's worth, is still a valuable property and something they can build on. They're just going to be more cautious and approach these with probably a finer comb going forward. And we're going to have to wait and see if they're allowed to put a live-action Peter Parker in the mix. My guess is no. But I want to hear your thoughts and opinions. Like the video, tell me, and we'll have a conversation down below.